So let me talk to you about what I believe responsible business entails. And I'm going to start with a story to fix ideas. So I think it's about, is it 3 months that we've been in lockdown? But let me at least take you on a journey to the other side of the world so that we're not locked in our own homes. Let me take you, at least metaphorically, to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. It stretches for 6,000 kilometers. It has some of the world's highest mountains, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, you might think it's quite fanciful for me to suggest that you imagine that you were there, because many of you haven't been there, but many of us might have actually seen this lake in a movie, The Constant Gardener, based on a John le Carré novel of the same name. And indeed, perhaps millions of people around the world have seen this lake because of this movie. But fewer than 1,000 people call Lake Magadi their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling and herding goats. So it used to be that cash was king for Emmanuel. So if he sold a goat, he'd receive cash. He'd then have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash in case he got robbed. And then if he wanted to bank that cash, he had to trek to the nearest bank. And this was not hours away, this was 1 day away. And as a consequence, he couldn't graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He had to always make sure that he was 1 day away from a bank. So his life was tough. But all of that changed in 2007 thanks to a responsible business. And that business we'll all know, it's Vodafone. So Vodafone launched a mobile money service, M-Pesa, in Kenya. Now let me take a minute to describe what mobile money is, because we often think that it's mobile banking. Right, I have a Barclays account and I can operate it on my phone rather than going to a branch. But mobile money is different. You don't even need to have a bank account, and that's important because many Kenyans were unbanked. And so this transformed Emmanuel's life, right? So he no longer needs to worry about cash, being the victim of forgery or robbery. And he doesn't need to walk 1 day to a bank. He can graze his goats in the greenest pastures. And there's many other knock-on effects, right? He is able to have, in his accounting, right, he's got a record of every transaction on his phone. And we don't just want to look at one story, we want to look at large-scale evidence. And indeed, a study by some professors at MIT found that within 7 years of launching M-Pesa, 200,000 households in Kenya got lifted out of poverty. And many of these households were headed by women because it allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there are many knock-on effects in terms of gender equality. So that's one story about Vodafone. But let me tell you a quite different story. And that story concerns tax, which is also a topic of responsible business. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company worldwide to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments around the world. And that's really important, particularly in telecoms. You could choose to locate your licenses in low tax regimes. So I've got a question to everybody on this webinar. In fact, I've got 2 questions. So the first is, which of these 2 decisions, M-Pesa or tax transparency, created most value for society? And which decision, if we hadn't taken it, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's corporate social responsibility rating? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody because I'm pretty sure that everybody will have the same answer. Which decision created most value for society? It was the first. M-Pesa lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. It provided financial inclusion to the unbanked. But what is the backlash if you don't innovate? It's often zero, right? The media doesn't get you into trouble for not coming up with this idea. Perhaps people never knew that this crazy idea of banking without a bank was even possible to begin with. Instead, the media punishes you not for errors of omission, failing to do good things, but errors of commission, doing bad things. So this might be engaging in a controversial share buyback, overpaying your CEO, or not being transparent about tax. And indeed, what are the consequences of that? Can be pretty severe. Indeed, Vodafone 2 years ago, 2 years prior to the tax transparency report, you might remember it was reported that they had avoided £6 billion of tax. And just coincidentally, at the same time, George Osborne, the Chancellor, announced 6 billion of austerity. So we can see the headlines, right? You, the taxpayer, are suffering austerity because of this large corporation being irresponsible. And we know what the consequences of that were: huge boycotts. Now, don't get me wrong. Clearly, paying fair tax is important, and paying fair wages is important, and not polluting the environment is important. But you already knew that before coming on this webinar. So what I want to do is to change our thinking somewhat about responsible business. Some folks think it's about do no harm, right? So Google had the motto do no evil for a while. But what I want to do is to think about actually actively doing good, right? So it's not just about avoiding scandals, right? Some people view responsible business about good risk management. It's about actively creating social value, even if doing so isn't going to reduce the likelihood of, say, a media backlash. Okay, so it's about not just doing no harm, but actively doing good. And so that gives the framework that is in the book that Eva kindly mentioned at the start. So if the value that a company creates is given by a pie, traditional view of responsibility is that a responsible business splits the pie fairly. And indeed, fairness is important. That's why we look at things like the ratio of CEO pay to worker pay. And so under this view, a responsible business is one that gives up part of the pie away from investors and gives them to stakeholders. So indeed, there's some great responses that businesses are making in this pandemic. For example, let's say Unilever is giving 100 million euros of food and sanitizer. It's also guaranteeing the jobs of its 150,000 workers. It's providing its suppliers with 500 million euros of liquidity. So that's what we often think responsibility entails. Again, don't get me wrong, right? Fairness is important, tax and wages and so on must be fair. But why I think this view of responsible business is limited is for two reasons. First is that if responsibility is only about splitting the pie differently, then this might be bad for the company's profits in the long term. And if it indeed is going to reduce profitability, then there's the concern that leaders might not adopt this voluntarily. So you might have cases where you could sign a business roundtable statement, as 181 CEOs did last August, but the accusation is they're not putting it into practice. And indeed, if responsibility involves less profit, then let's just sign this statement and then not actually follow through with it. And the second reason why responsibility can't just be about splitting the pie differently is that it's bad for investors. Now, many business reformers will say, I don't care about that, right? Because the common perception is that investors are them, stakeholder society are us, and if we are to take from them and give to us, then that's good, right? Investors are nameless, faceless capitalists according to that viewpoint. But obviously I'm preaching to the converted when I speak to the audience, right? I don't need to tell the audience that investors have a crucial role to play in repurposing the economy, right? They involve parents saving for their children's education, pension funds investing for retirement, or insurance companies funding future claims. And again, while I'm preaching to converted in this audience, this does go against a lot of thinking, which is to repurpose business. We need to reduce shareholder rights, move away from shareholder primacy, and so forth, because investors are viewed as a force that just extracts profit for themselves and at the expense of society. So this is why my view of responsibility is different. Yes, fairness in terms of the distribution of the pie is important, but responsibility is much more about growing the pie. So actively creating value.